Imagine waking up before the sun even thinks about rising, your straw mat itchy from the heat that never really went away overnight. Your feet hit the dirt floor, and the first thing you see is dust floating in the weak light, clinging to the air like it has nowhere better to be. You're not royalty, not a scribe, not a soldier. You're something much more ordinary, something much harder. You're a farmer in ancient Egypt, and it sucks. From the outside, people today imagine ancient Egypt as this dazzling world of golden tombs, majestic pyramids, and wise pharaohs ruling from sparkling palaces. But for most of the people who lived there, none of that mattered. They never saw the inside of a palace. They didn't marvel at their own pyramids. They were too busy hauling water, breaking their backs under the sun, and praying the Nile didn't destroy their crops or forget to flood at all. For them, Egypt wasn't a kingdom of gods. It was a kingdom of endless work. Life on the Nile may sound romantic now, but it was anything but peaceful. The Nile was everything. If it flooded too much, it destroyed your home. If it didn't flood enough, your crops died, your family starved, and your taxes still showed up like clockwork. You could be punished for nature's mistakes. Imagine working a field for months, watching it wither, and still owing the same grain quota to the temple or the government. There were no excuses, no refunds, and it wasn't just the work that made it miserable. The heat was merciless. The tools were primitive. You had a wooden plow pulled by a cow or an ox, and if that animal died, good luck. Replacing it was nearly impossible. Your entire family depended on that beast, and more than once, families lost everything because of a single sick ox. So tried pulling the plow themselves. Imagine that, digging up hardened clay with your own body, sweat mixing with sand, grit in your teeth. And you still had a smile when the tax collector showed up. Families lived in small mud brick houses that crumbled slowly under the weight of the sun and time. There was no privacy, no comfort, no break from the biting insects, the skin infections, the stomach parasites. You didn't get weekends off. You didn't get a dream about retirement. You worked until you couldn't, and then your children took over. And if you were lucky, they didn't leave for the army or die from disease before they could help. It's easy to think of ancient farmers as nameless figures in a dusty timeline, but they were real people. People with fears, families, dreams, and pain. People like Mary. He was born to a farmer's life, just like his father and his father before that. Mary had strong arms, calloused hands, and a tired heart. He knew how to read the sky and the color of the river. He could tell when the flood was going to be late just by the taste of the morning wind. But none of that made his life easier. When Mary was just 12, he watched his older brother get beaten by a temple official for failing to meet his grain quota. The family had done everything they could, but the rains didn't come. The harvest failed, and the gods didn't care. His brother limped for the rest of his life, and Mary never forgot the way his mother cried that night. That was the moment he understood being a farmer wasn't just hard. It was dangerous. Despite it all, Mary tried. He learned the rhythms of the land, passed down from voices long gone. He learned to tie bundles of wheat just so, to avoid bruising the stalks. He learned how to mend a plow using string and patience. He learned which weeds to leave alone and which would poison the goats. But the more he learned, the more he realized the odds were stacked against him. Every year brought new problems. Locusts, unexpected drought, too much rain, crops stolen by bandits at night, disease spreading through the village. And yet the officials always came, stone-faced and unforgiving. They didn't care about reasons. They only wanted grain. They showed up with scribes who wrote down every sack, every jar, every missed payment. Sometimes they took more than grain. Tools, furniture, livestock. There were rumors of families losing their children to conscription for unpaid debts. And Mary was haunted by those rumors. One year, the flood didn't come at all. The river turned lazy, thin, like it was hiding something. The land cracked open, begging for water. Mary walked the fields in silence, his sandals scraping over dead earth. He knew what this meant. No crops, no food, no payment. He stood there, eyes stinging, dust swirling around him. He heard his brother's screams from years ago echo in his mind. He knew what was coming. His wife, Asha, was trying to stay strong. She dried wild fig for the winter and whispered prayers under her breath when she thought no one was listening. She kissed their children's foreheads at night, as if trying to protect them with her warmth. Mary saw her hands trembling when she lifted the water jar. It was half full. It had to last. That season, whispers spread through the village like fire through straw. Tax collectors were arriving early. They were angry. They'd been warned by higher officials to make an example of anyone who fell behind. Mary felt a weight in his chest that no labor could lift. The nights were silent, heavy with dread. Dogs didn't bark. Babies didn't cry. Even the insects seemed to wait. And when the collectors finally arrived, nothing could prepare them. Dust kicked up by their sandals filled the sky behind them, like a storm on two legs. They wore linen robes stiff with sweat and authority. Their scribes followed, carrying scrolls and sharp-tipped reeds. The village held its breath. People came out of their homes slowly, eyes downcast, offering what little they had. But it wasn't enough. They reached Mary's house late in the day, when the shadows stretched like fingers across the cracked earth. Asha stood beside him, clutching the children. Mary held out a small basket of barley, all they had managed to salvage. The lead official didn't even look at it. He glanced at the scribe, who nodded solemnly and scribbled something down. Then he pointed at Mary's oldest son. Mary's heart dropped into his stomach. And just like that, the weight of ancient Egypt, the temples, the pharaohs, the gods carved in stone, came crashing down on one poor farmer and his terrified son. The official's voice was calm but firm. "He'll serve until your debt is paid." Mary stepped forward, shielding his son with his body. His hands were shaking. His voice caught in his throat. Around them, neighbors looked away. No one dared speak. They'd seen this before. They knew how this story went. But Mary didn't move. Not yet. And as the sun set behind the distant pyramids that glittered for someone else's glory, Mary stood at the edge of a choice that could cost him everything, or change the course of his entire village's fate. The air was thick with tension. The official didn't blink. He stood with the kind of posture only someone used to power could maintain, shoulders squared, jaw set, hands resting lightly on a leather belt that probably never touched soil. Mary's boy, barely 13, clung to his mother's side. His eyes were wide, dark, too young to hold the kind of fear they did now. Asha's breath was shallow. She didn't cry, didn't speak. She just looked at her husband, silently begging for a miracle that wouldn't come. Mary cleared his throat. "He's a child," he said, his voice cracking with the dryness of the air and the weight in his chest. "We have no grain, no animals. Take the tools if you must." The official didn't respond at first. He reached out for the small basket of barley and tilted it just enough for some of the contents to spill out onto the dusty ground. He let it fall from his hand like it meant nothing, which to him, it didn't. He turned to the scribe, nodded once, then looked back at Mary. "Your debt is greater than the worth of your son," he said simply. "He will serve at the temple fields. Hard labor. One season. Perhaps two." Mary's hands curled into fists. His feet felt rooted to the ground. In his mind, he saw his son's future play out, rising before dawn, breaking stones, dragging ropes, falling asleep on bare earth under a whipped shadow. The Nile wasn't a river of life. It was a river of survival, and right now they were drowning. "You take him," Mary whispered, "and I will have nothing left to work with. No help, no family." The official raised an eyebrow. "Then you should have planned better." There it was, the casual cruelty of someone born above it all. To him, this was just another tally. Another entry in a long list of peasant families bled dry. The temples would get their food. The priests would get their offerings. And Mary? Mary would disappear like dust swept into the Nile. A few villagers stood at a distance, watching. Some had lost sons to the same fate. Others were too scared to intervene. Speaking out meant punishment, and punishment didn't always stop with the person who spoke. It reached their wives, their brothers, their entire household. Silence, in this world, was often the safest choice. Mary's son was breathing fast now. Asha pulled him close, her fingers trembling. She looked at Mary one last time, a silent plea written across her face. "Don't let them take him." But what could Mary do? He stepped forward again, this time slower, eyes locked with the officials. "Let me serve in his place," he said. "I'll go. You want labor? You take me." The official hesitated. This wasn't the typical offer. Most farmers begged, cried, tried to bribe. Few offered themselves instead. Perhaps it was pride, or desperation, or maybe Mary had simply had enough. Whatever it was, it caught the official off guard. "You," the man asked. "You're older, slower, less valuable, but experienced," Mary said quickly. "I know the land. I can work without needing to be taught. I won't run." The scribe looked up from his scroll, interested now. He whispered something to the official. The two exchanged a brief glance. Finally, the man said, "Very well. 2 seasons. If your quotas aren't met by then, we take the boy anyway." And the girl. Mary flinched. Asha's mouth opened slightly, but she didn't speak. The children clung to her, confused and frightened. Mary nodded, unable to do anything else. He had no choice. This was mercy in its cruelest form. That night, he didn't sleep. The house felt heavier without hope. The walls seemed to lean inward, the clay whispering old warnings in a language only the desperate could hear. He sat in the corner of the room, sharpening a broken tool that wouldn't be needed anymore. Asha sat beside him in silence, brushing her daughter's hair with slow, mechanical motions. In the quiet, he remembered his own father, a hard man, weathered by the sun and quiet rage. He never said he loved Mary, but his hands built their first plow from scratch. When he died, Mary found a tiny wooden carving of a fish under his sleeping mat. He kept it in his pocket for years until it cracked apart. Love in ancient Egypt wasn't spoken. It was labored into being. At dawn, Mary left with the officials. He didn't cry. He didn't kiss his family goodbye. He just nodded once and followed, the same way thousands of men had before him. Nameless, faceless, forgotten. Another body to pull another plow. Another soul to bleed into temple grain. The walk was long and dusty. They moved past fields where others were already at work, shoulders hunched, backs bent in obedience to the sun. No one looked up. The land around them wasn't alive. It was tired, drained, exhausted by generations of men like Mary giving everything and gaining nothing. When they reached the temple lands, he was handed a rope and shown to a storage barn. There were others there, sleeping on mats, some too weak to stand. Mary recognized a face or two. Old neighbors. Many thought had died. They hadn't. They were just here, buried alive beneath grain quotas and silent gods. And so began Mary's service. Days bled into nights with no distinction. The work was endless. Hauling water, turning soil, feeding animals, cleaning, repairing. No one spoke much. The ones who did were new, and they stopped eventually. The guards didn't hit unless they had to, but they always seemed like they were waiting for an excuse. Every evening, a scribe would count the rations. Bread, beer, dried onions. Just enough to stay alive. Just enough to keep moving. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, Mary would look at the stars and wonder if his son was sleeping. If his daughter had started walking barefoot like her mother. If Asha had taken over the fields or gotten help from the neighbors. He tried not to think about the what if. That way led only to pain. One morning, a commotion stirred near the temple granary. A worker had collapsed, not from sickness but hunger. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. When Mary and the others tried to carry him inside, a guard barked at them to leave him. The man wouldn't make it. They were told not to waste energy. But Mary couldn't ignore it. That night, he took part of his own bread, just a crust, and snuck it to the man. Another worker noticed. Word spread quietly. Some began to share what they could. Nothing grand, just crumbs. But it meant something. In a place that tried to erase kindness, they were holding on to it. Still, trouble was brewing. The harvest was approaching, and everyone knew the quotas wouldn't be met. The Nile had risen too early. Fields were too wet. Run had set in. The priests were panicking, and when priests panicked, people suffered. Rumors began to spread of harsher punishments, of new officials being sent to correct inefficiencies, of new quotas that made old ones look merciful. And in the middle of it all, Mary worked. He watched. He listened. And he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, something could change. If maybe silence wasn't the safest option after all. If a man had nothing left to lose, maybe he finally had something worth fighting for. Because Mary was tired of surviving. He was ready to resist. But how do you fight a system that's lasted for thousands of years? How do you rebel in a land where even the river bows to kings? That question lingered in the air like dust over dry earth, waiting to settle, waiting for the first footstep to break it open. That night, Mary lay on a thin mat, staring up at the cracked ceiling of the worker's hut. The air was hot and unmoving, and the scent of sweat, damp straw, and dust clung to everything. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. Not since the flood failed. Not since the quotas increased. And especially not since the whispers started. Whispers of punishment, of men disappearing in the night, of harsher officials arriving from the capital. He could feel something was about to change. Earlier that day, a man named Hapu had approached him during a short break under a fig tree. Hapu was older, maybe 50, his back bent from decades of field work, his voice always low and slow, like the river in dry season. "They're sending someone new," Hapu muttered, eyes flicking side to side. "A scribe from Wazit. Big temple connections. High-ranking. They say he'll make examples out of us." Mary nodded once. He wasn't surprised. The temple elites were growing nervous. When the gods didn't get their offerings on time, someone had to pay. And it was never the priests. It was the farmers. Always the farmers. Hapu looked at him closely. "We can't meet the quota," he said simply. "Even if we worked until our bones cracked. There's not enough crop." "I know," Mary said, his voice quiet. "They know too. They just don't care." That truth sat heavy between them. They both understood how this worked. The scribes would arrive, scrolls in hand, and begin counting. They'd find a grain short, accuse the workers of theft or laziness, and punish whoever they wanted. There were no real trials, no chances to explain, just blame and pain. Mary couldn't stop thinking about his family. His wife, Asha, his son, nearly a man now, learning to carry buckets, digging trenches with a stick carved into a shovel. His daughter, too young to remember her father's face if he stayed away much longer. 2 seasons of labor, the officials had said. But the calendar meant nothing if the priests changed the rules. What if he never saw them again? He rolled over on the mat, pushing the thoughts away, but they clung to him. He thought of his village, small and cracked like sun-baked pottery. Of his neighbors, quiet and tired, worn thin by years of fear. He remembered how, before he left, the children didn't play anymore. They sat in the shade, eyes blank, already learning to survive instead of live. The next day, everything shifted. Just after the morning rations were handed out, a column of men entered the work camp. They wore clean linen robes, and their sandals didn't carry dust. At the front was a man younger than Mary expected, tall, sharp-faced, and cold-eyed. His name was Neebmakit, a royal scribe known across the region for his strictness. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply looked, and people went quiet. Behind him, soldiers followed, dressed in simple leather, clubs at their sides. They weren't here to guard grain. They were here to keep people in line. Neebmakit didn't waste time. He ordered the scribes to begin counting every sack, every barrel, every unfinished row of wheat. Workers were pulled from the fields and questioned in the hot sun. Some were accused of hoarding, others of laziness. Punishments came quickly, a lash, a day without rations, extra night shifts. And then Neebmakit made a speech. He stood on a stone block and spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the dusty courtyard. "The gods have given you fertile land. The Nile has blessed your soil. If you fail to meet your quota, it is not the river's fault. It is yours." Mary stood among the others, fists clenched, jaw tight. His shoulders ached. His lips were dry. But what made him angriest wasn't the lie. It was how easily the others accepted it. Heads bowed, eyes lowered. No one moved. No one spoke. The system worked because they let it, because they were too tired, too hungry, too afraid to resist. That night, a man named Dadu was taken. No explanation, just a shadow in the dark and the thud of sandals leaving camp. His mat remained untouched the next morning. His tools still leaned against the wall. The silence that followed was heavier than any shovel Mary had ever lifted. It was enough. Later that evening, under the cracked wall behind the grain barn, Mary spoke to Hapu again. "We can't wait for them to decide who's next." Hapu looked at him sideways. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time we decide," Mary replied. The words felt dangerous in his mouth, like fire trying to hide in dry grass. But Hapu didn't flinch. He nodded slowly, thoughtfully. By the next day, 3 others had joined them. Quietly, carefully. None of them had weapons. They had no plan to overthrow anything. But they had something more dangerous. They had each other. They began sharing extra food, covering for each other during inspections, repairing broken tools together to avoid punishments. Small acts, nothing grand, but enough to make life just slightly more bearable. Still, Nemekit noticed. He called Mary forward one morning under the blistering sun. Mary wiped his brow, stepped forward without hesitation. "I've heard your name," the scribe said, looking at him with narrow eyes. "You're the one who offered himself instead of his son." Mary said nothing. Nemekit stepped closer. Loyal, useful, but stubborn. Still, Mary stayed silent. "You could work in the granary," Nemekit offered. "A roof, better rations, less field work, but only if you help keep order." It was a test, a temptation. Mary saw it clearly for what it was. "No," he said. The scribe's face twitched for half a second, the only sign of surprise. Then he nodded slowly and dismissed Mary with a flick of his fingers. From that day, inspections became more frequent. Work hours stretched longer. Anyone found resting was beaten or docked rations. It was their version of a message: don't say no. But the men who worked beside Mary? They noticed. They saw him refuse. They saw him stand. And it planted a seed. One afternoon, while repairing a broken irrigation channel, one of the younger workers leaned close and whispered, "You think there's more of us? Willing to do something?" Mary didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky instead. The sun glared down like a god with no pity. The clouds were thin and meaningless. Still, he nodded. "Maybe," he said. By the end of the week, 10 men were meeting in secret after dark, beneath a ruined storage hut. They didn't speak of rebellion. Not yet. But they shared ideas. What if they slowed production? What if they hid tools to delay progress? What if they spread rumors that the grain was already spoiling? Small acts, little delays, just enough to confuse the system. And it worked for a while. But systems like these don't crumble quietly. For a moment, the entire courtyard stood frozen in time. The sun pressed down like a weight from the sky, and Mary felt every drop of sweat slide down his back. His heart pounded against his ribs, not just with fear, but with something older, deeper. Rage. Tired. Ancient rage passed down from father to son, from farmer to farmer, like a cursed tool no one could throw away. Nemekit turned to face him. His eyes narrowed, confused. Not angry yet, just surprised. "You dare interrupt justice?" he asked calmly. Mary looked at Seneb, who was now on his knees, hands trembling, lips cracked and dry. The old man didn't even seem to understand what was happening. His mind was too far gone. He had no words left, just quiet gasps of exhaustion. This was the man they had chosen to punish? This was justice? "I will not let you beat him," Mary said, voice firm but low. That was when the anger came. Nemekit's mouth twitched, a flicker of a sneer. He motioned to the guards, and one stepped forward, club in hand. But Mary didn't move. He stood his ground. And then, something unexpected happened. Another worker stepped forward, and another, then 2 more. They didn't speak. They didn't raise fists. They simply stood, tired, sunburned, filthy from labor, but straight, silent, solid. Mary felt something shift in the dust around them. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It had turned into something sharper, something braver, the kind of quiet resistance that no army could see coming until it was too late. Nemekit's eyes darted across the line of workers now forming behind Mary. His calm wavered. He wasn't used to disobedience. Not like this. Not so open. Not so steady. He raised his voice. This man was caught stealing tools. The damage to the crop will affect the offering. The gods will not be pleased. "We all work the same land," Mary said. "The tools are shared. The damage came from rot and storm. You want someone to blame? Blame the Nile. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone coughed. Someone else nodded. The guards didn't move. Not yet. Nemekit's face darkened. If one man resists, he is punished. If many resist, they are erased. There it was, the threat. It was loud, clear, and real. But Mary didn't back down. We know that already, he said. But maybe we're not afraid anymore. That last line hit harder than he expected. For weeks, years even, fear had been the only currency that kept the system running. Fear of punishment, fear of hunger, fear of gods that never spoke, never answered. But in that single moment, under the merciless sun, something had cracked open. The fear was still there, but it had lost its grip. Nemekit stared at them. The silence stretched. He looked at the guards, waited for one of them to act. But they hesitated. Even they had seen enough. Beating a half-dead old man while surrounded by silent, united workers? That wasn't a good look, even for a temple scribe. Finally, Nemekit hissed through his teeth. Take the old man away. Feed him. Keep him out of the fields. He turned to Mary. And you, your debt is not forgotten. I'll be watching. With that, he spun on his heel and stormed away, his robe kicking up dust. The guards followed, reluctantly. The scribes trailed behind, whispering among themselves. And just like that, the courtyard was empty again, except for the workers who had stood and the man who had dared speak. Mary exhaled, but the tension didn't leave him. The others looked at him now, not just with gratitude, but with expectation. They'd taken a step together, and that step meant something. Now, the question wasn't if they'd fight back. It was how. That evening, the camp was unusually quiet. Even the insects seemed hesitant. No one laughed. No one sang. But there was a calmness, too. A kind of peace that hadn't been felt in weeks. Seneb rested in the granary, asleep on clean straw for the first time in years. Someone had given him a real blanket. Someone else had left him dried fish and clean water. These were small things. Tiny acts, but they were the first real signs that change might be possible. Later, as the stars emerged one by one across the darkening sky, Mary sat outside the barn with Hapu beside him. You know they'll come back harder, Hapu said. Mary nodded. I know. They might bring soldiers next time. Real ones. I know. Hapu was quiet for a while. Then he sat still. I'm glad you did it. Mary didn't answer. He just stared at the stars, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man trying to breathe in a world built to crush lungs. But he also felt something else, something that had been missing for a long time. Hope. The days that followed weren't easy. The inspections grew harsher. Food rations tightened. And yet the unity among the workers began to grow. They started organizing shifts more carefully, sharing knowledge, supporting each other. The youngest helped the oldest. Those who could read whispered what they saw on the scrolls. They learned which guards could be bribed with bread, which ones were simply angry, and which might even be sympathetic. Whispers of their actions began to reach other work camps. Word traveled along the irrigation channels, down the roads, across villages. Other farmers began asking questions. If one man could speak out and survive, could they? In one village, a group of women refused to send their sons to temple labor. In another, a scribe was chased out after raising taxes during a drought. None of this made it into official records, of course, but it was happening quietly like water soaking into dry soil. Mary didn't ask to be a leader. He still thought of himself as just a farmer, a husband, a father. But now, others looked to him for direction. One night, he was approached by a younger man named Kabi. He had grown up near the border, in a harsher part of Egypt where land was even less forgiving. I've seen what happens when men wait too long to fight back, Kabi said. They don't get buried. They just vanish. Mary nodded. Kabi added, but now I've seen what happens when one man stands. There was a pause. Kabi smiled just a little. Maybe it's time we all stood. And as those words settled between them, carried on the wind that rolled across the fields of cracked earth and tired hands, the night suddenly didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. But they knew it wouldn't last. There were rumors of reinforcements, of orders coming from Wazit, of new decrees written in gold ink that demanded obedience at any cost. The priests were growing restless. The temples were losing their grip, and those in power never gave up that grip willingly. Soon, there would be a reckoning, and when it came, Mary knew the fields of Egypt would not stay quiet. Not this time. Before Mary ever stood against the scribe, before he became the quiet name passed along temple walls and farmer trails, he had lived a life that most would never see or remember. He was born in a low-lying village just off the edge of the Nile's seasonal floodplain, in a home so small that when it rained too hard, water would leak from the roof and puddle beneath his family's only sleeping mat. His father was a man of few words and hard habits, waking before dawn, working without rest, and drinking boiled river herbs at night to calm the aches in his knees. Mary never questioned this rhythm. In Egypt, questions didn't change much. You did what you had to do, and you hoped the gods or the Nile, or someone, was paying attention. But the gods, at least in Mary's world, were always far away. They lived in temples too grand for the poor to enter, behind gates guarded by men who never tilled a single row of earth. Their statues were cleaned with oils while farmers like Mary walked barefoot over thorns and stone. People said the gods watched over the harvests, that they judged the hearts of men. But no god had ever stopped a child from starving, and none had helped his mother when she died of a fever after Mary turned 10. What comfort was offered came from neighbors, not gods. A small bowl of lentils, a cup of date beer, a wordless hug. It was people, not spirits, that carried the living. By the time Mary had children of his own, he understood what survival really meant in ancient Egypt. Not just food and shelter, but learning how to avoid notice. When to speak, when to stay silent. Which officials you could ask for mercy, and which ones to avoid completely. Every year, the rules changed. And every year, the farmers were expected to pretend they hadn't noticed. Some gave up entirely and disappeared. Into the desert, into the military, into the unknown. Mary chose to stay. Not because he was brave, but because he believed in one small, fragile thing, the land. Even after everything, after the taxes, the droughts, the broken tools, and broken promises, he still believed the earth could be good, that it remembered those who cared for it, that maybe, just maybe, his children wouldn't have to work it the same way he did. But the land wasn't safe anymore. Not after the last failed flood. The river had betrayed them, or maybe the priests had. People whispered that the temples had taken too much water, dammed it off for their rituals. Others said the gods were angry, angered by laziness, by disloyalty, by silence. Whatever the reason, the earth had cracked open like a broken pot, and now everyone was paying the price. In the growing tension around the temple granaries, the conflict wasn't just about food anymore. It was about power. For generations, the priests had used famine and abundance alike as tools. If the harvest was good, they claimed credit. If it was bad, they blamed the people. It was a game that worked only as long as the farmers played along. Now, they weren't so sure they wanted to. Behind the temple walls, scrolls were being unrolled, decisions carved into clay. The scribe Nebuchadnezzar had sent word back to Wazit that defiance was spreading among the laborers. He didn't use Mary's name, not yet, but he described a man of influence, someone who stirred the workers with silence more than speech. Higher priests read his words and frowned. They saw what he saw, the early cracks in a dam that had held for centuries. If one village stood, more might follow. And if the laborers began to speak in unison, to question, to refuse, then the foundations of the divine order itself could tremble. Mary didn't know what kind of storm his quiet defiance had begun. All he knew was that things had changed. Where once the workers only whispered about injustice, now they planned around it. They started gathering and used seeds and burying them in hidden jars in case of ration cuts. They sharpened old wooden tools not just for farming, but in case of defense. And every night, when the wind shifted across the riverbank, they met in pairs or trios, heads close, voices low. Hapu brought news from the village routes. He said temple scribes had visited neighboring camps. In one, a young man had been accused of sowing discontent and was taken away in the middle of the night. No one had seen him since. In another, Guards had forced mothers to send their sons to work at the granaries, even though their families were already barely surviving. The system wasn't cracking, it was tightening its grip. Like a snake that feels threatened, it was striking faster and harder. But Mary didn't run. He couldn't. His promise still echoed in his ears. 2 seasons of service in place of his son. That time was almost over, but he had no illusions. They wouldn't let him go easily. Not now. He was a problem, and problems in Egypt had a way of disappearing. Still, he didn't plan on disappearing quietly. He began keeping records in his own way, scratching marks on smooth stones, using dried reed tips to press symbols into old clay scraps. Not words. He couldn't write, but signs only he and a few others understood. A line for each worker beaten. A dot for every day without rations. A cross for every person taken and not returned. A secret history of the camp's suffering, hidden beneath his mat, beneath the straw. Because if they couldn't tell their stories openly, they'd find another way. What Mary didn't know was that someone else had noticed. Among the temple scribes was a young apprentice named Hika. Thin, quiet, barely older than Mary's son. He carried scrolls, ran errands, rarely spoke. But he listened, and he watched. He saw how the guards rolled their eyes whenever Nebuchadnezzar gave orders. He saw how the workers' eyes followed Mary when no one else was looking. And he began to wonder if everything he'd been taught was the truth or just the version the temple wanted him to believe. One evening, while passing near the outer storage hut, Hika saw Mary burying something beneath loose straw. He didn't report it. He didn't tell the guards. He just watched. Then he quietly began asking questions of other scribes, of servants, of the older workers. Not direct questions, just nudges, whispers, looking for pieces of a story that didn't match the one he'd grown up with. Because something about Mary unsettled him, and something about the temple no longer felt right. Meanwhile, Nebuchadnezzar prepared for a new inspection. This time, he'd be bringing a small unit of soldiers. They were coming under the pretense of escorting grain shipments, but he had made it clear to his contacts that they were also there to discourage disobedience. The message was simple: the temple still ruled, and anyone who forgot that would remember soon enough. The night before the inspection, Mary and the others gathered behind the granary, the sky thick with stars and tension. They didn't know about the soldiers. Not yet, but they could feel the weight of something building. "They'll test us again," Hapu said. "Push harder than before." Mary looked out at the horizon, where the palm trees whispered secrets to the breeze. "Then we don't give them what they want." "And what if they take more?" someone asked. "More than food, more than work." Mary didn't answer, because he knew the truth. They already had. And tomorrow, the reckoning would begin. The next morning began like any other, with the taste of dust on the tongue and the weight of weariness in every bone. But something in the air was different. The birds were quieter. The dogs in the distance didn't bark. Even the river, usually lapping gently at the banks before sunrise, seemed unusually still. Mary woke before the others, the hairs on his arms already raised with a feeling he couldn't explain. A strange silence had wrapped itself around the camp, and it made every breath feel like a risk. He walked to the edge of the worksite where the fields began, pretending to check the irrigation channels. In the distance, just beyond the far line of sycamore trees, he saw them, shadows moving in formation. Soldiers, a full unit, maybe 12 men. Spears gleamed under the morning sun. Their sandals kicked up neat clouds of dust. They marched like they had a purpose, like they were arriving not for protection, but for control. Mary returned quietly to the granary and found Hapu already awake, chewing a piece of dry bread and squinting into the sunrise. "They're here, aren't they?" Hapu asked without looking at him. Mary nodded. "Yes, soldiers this time." Hapu wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stood slowly. His joints popped as he moved. "Then we were right. They're scared." That thought stayed with Mary as the others woke and began their routines. No one had seen the soldiers yet, but soon the news trickled in. Workers stopped what they were doing. Eyes darted. The usual sounds, grumbling, tool clinking, water pouring into pots, all fell away. By the time Nebuchadnezzar entered the courtyard with his new escort, The entire camp was silent, as if holding one collective breath. He didn't climb the stone block this time. He didn't need to. The soldiers at his back said everything. Inspection will begin immediately, Nebuchadnezzar announced. Any interference, any lies, and punishment will be swift. You will show gratitude for the gods' patience by complying without delay. No one moved. Mary stepped forward. We've complied, he said plainly. We've worked through flood and drought. We've met the quotas as best we could. We've done more with less than ever before. Nebuchadnezzar's jaw clenched. Your job is not to question. Mary stared at him. No, it's to survive. He motioned behind him. Dozens of men, filthy, sunburned, exhausted, stood side by side. Many had bruises, raw hands, sun-split lips. But all of them were upright. None looked away. You don't feed us, Mary continued. You don't pay us. You take what little we grow, and then you punish us when the land gives up. We've served, and now our season is over. Nebuchadnezzar gave a short, mirthless laugh. You think you decide when it's over? No, Mary said, but we do decide if we keep working. The soldiers shifted slightly, their spears lowering just a hair. Hapu stepped forward too. We're not rebelling, he said. We're just done. A ripple passed through the workers behind them. No shouts, no raised fists, just the sound of tools being laid down in the dust. One by one, dozens. A chorus of wooden handles hitting the ground. The quiet rebellion of the overworked. Nebuchadnezzar's eyes flared with fury. This is sedition. It's survival, Mary said again. And we choose not to die in your fields. Hika, the young scribe, was watching from the edge of the courtyard. He'd been told to observe and report, to write down what he saw without emotion. But emotion was unavoidable now. He watched Mary stand in front of armed soldiers, his clothes torn, his skin burned, but his voice unshaken. He felt something shift inside him, a realization, heavy and painful, that maybe everything he'd been taught about order, about loyalty, was meant to keep people like Mary silent forever. Nebuchadnezzar raised a hand, signaling the nearest soldier. The guard stepped forward, gripping his staff tightly, waiting for the order to strike. Then Hika did something no one expected. He stepped between them. The guard froze, uncertain. Nebuchadnezzar's mouth opened in disbelief. What are you doing? He hissed. Hika's voice was calm but firm. You asked me to record what I saw. This is what I see. A man who served beyond what was asked. A man who gave his own body in place of his son. And men around him who have bled for years with no reward. Nebuchadnezzar stepped down from the stone, eyes blazing. You're not here to judge. You're a scribe. Hika held his ground. So let me write the truth. Silence again. The soldiers looked to Nebuchadnezzar, uncertain. Orders were one thing. But what if their actions reached the higher priests and the truth made them look like tyrants? What if this wasn't just another camp? What if this moment, if recorded by a scribe, changed how others saw the entire system? The power shifted again. Nebuchadnezzar seethed. This man will leave with nothing. He will not be praised. He will not be remembered. But even as he spoke, another worker came forward. Then a second. Then a third. They gathered beside Mary, not to fight, but simply to stand. And in the face of all the gods' fury and the temple's power, they stood as one. Mary turned to Nebuchadnezzar. Then forget me, he said. But remember that this, he looked at the crowd of farmers, heads high despite their hunger. This is what you created. Nebuchadnezzar stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned his back and walked away. The soldiers hesitated, but they followed. Hika stood for a few more moments, watching the dust rise behind the scribe's retreating sandals. Then he approached Mary and handed him a small clay tablet. Etched on it were simple lines, crude but clear. Your name, Hika said quietly, and what you did. Mary looked at the tablet, then back at the young scribe. Why? Because someone should remember. Mary didn't reply. He just held the tablet close and turned back to the others, to the men who had stood beside him, and to the fields they had worked with blood and tears. He still didn't know what came next, whether things would truly change, whether the priest would come back harder. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone. And as the sun climbed higher, the land seemed a little less cruel. A breeze rolled across the field, gentle and cool, as if the Nile itself had finally taken notice. That afternoon, as the heat lifted slightly and the sun drifted behind a thin veil of clouds, the men returned to the fields, not to work, but to walk. For the first time in what felt like years, they strolled through the rows of wheat and flax, not as slaves to a schedule, but as free men, tired, wary, uncertain, but free in their own hearts. Mary walked ahead, silent, his eyes moving over the land he had spent his entire life breaking open and coaxing into life. The earth was still cracked and tired. The plants still leaned wearily toward a stingy sky. But something felt different now. He no longer saw this place as a prison. He saw it as something worth defending on his own terms. The younger workers talked in hushed tones behind him. Some were unsure of what they had just done, what they had risked. Others felt pride beginning to rise slowly beneath their ribs. No one quite believed they had won anything. They hadn't overthrown a system or changed any laws. But they had drawn a line. They had spoken. And more importantly, they had been heard. That night, no guards walked the perimeter. No officials barked orders. No whips cracked across tired backs. The camp sat in uneasy peace, like a tired beast finally resting its limbs after a long chase. In the quiet, people began to do things they hadn't done in a long time. One man pulled out a reed flute and played a soft melody near the fire. Another woman, visiting from the village nearby, braided her child's hair and told an old story from her grandmother. Something about a jackal who outwitted a lion with nothing but patience and wit. Mary sat with Hapu under a low fig tree and watched the firelight flicker against the side of the clay granary. "You think it'll last?" Hapu asked. Mary didn't answer right away. He watched the stars begin to fill the sky. The air was cool now, but not cold. A breeze came in from the riverbank, carrying with it the scent of wet reeds and the distant sound of frogs. "No," Mary said eventually, "but I think it was enough for today." Hapu nodded. "That might be all we ever get." "Then we take it," Mary said. And remember how it felt. Across the courtyard, Hika stood outside his quarters, watching the firelight like the others. But in his hands, he was already writing. Not a formal scroll, not yet, but small notes, etched into clay. He was recording names, events, details that could so easily vanish if someone didn't write them down. He wasn't sure what he would do with it all. He only knew he had to preserve it. Because somewhere deep inside, he feared that one day soon, someone powerful would try to erase this moment. He didn't want to let them. Hika wrote down Mary's name again, not just as a farmer, but as a witness, a participant, a symbol. A week passed, then another. Life didn't change overnight. It never did in Egypt. The temple quotas still existed. The priests still sent scribes to collect data, and laborers still returned to the fields. But something had softened. The inspections came slower. The punishments less frequent. And in nearby camps, more farmers started asking questions. Why are we beaten for crops that never grew? Why are our children taken while the scribes sit in shade? Why do the gods only speak through hunger? Mary was allowed to return home at the end of the second week. No card arrived. No formal release. Just a quiet message delivered through a village runner. Your term is finished. Return to your land. Do not speak of what happened here. But by then, the story had already spread. When Mary stepped back onto his home field, the grass was dry and the air dusty. His son had grown taller in just those weeks. His daughter ran to him, nearly tripping on her own feet. Asha stood by the well, arms folded, lips trembling. She didn't speak at first. Neither did he. They just looked at each other until the silence gave way and she rushed forward, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "You came back," she whispered. "I promised," he said. Later that evening, as the stars settled above the village, Mary walked through the rows of his own field, touching the stalks of grain like they were old friends. Everything looked smaller than he remembered. Or maybe he had just grown, not in height but in knowing. He no longer walked like someone waiting for permission to live. He walked like someone who had survived something large and dark and decided to step into the light anyway. In the following weeks, travelers began to stop by his home. Some were friends. Some were strangers. Some brought bread or baskets. Others just brought stories. Stories of workers in Thebes refusing to haul stones unless fed properly. Stories of villages planting hidden gardens far from temple reach. Stories of young scribes leaving the priesthood altogether, seeking different ways to serve the people rather than the gods. The officials still ruled. The temples still held power. But the fear that had once gripped the farmers by the throat had loosened. And all across the floodplain, people began to look up when they spoke. One evening, a young woman from a town Mary had never heard of brought him a scroll. It had no formal seal, no decoration, just simple black ink, neatly written. She placed it in his hands and said, "It's being passed from camp to camp." He unrolled it slowly. It began with a name. Not a king, not a priest, just a farmer. A man who said no. A man who stood. And beneath it were other names. Dozens. Then hundreds. And blank spaces left for more. Mary sat on the edge of his field as the sun sank behind the palm trees and the last light touched the Nile with gold. He looked down at the scroll again and, for the first time in his life, didn't feel small. He felt part of something bigger. He picked up a piece of charcoal, pressed it to the scroll, and wrote one more name. Not for himself, for the ones who hadn't been able to stand. Yet, in the weeks that followed Mary's return, the quiet in the village felt both peaceful and uneasy, like the lull before a gathering storm. On the surface, life resumed its usual rhythm. Farmers rose before the sun. Animals were herded to the watering holes. Women ground barley by hand, and children chased one another between the shade of the palms. But something had shifted beneath that routine. It was subtle, like a ripple under still water. People were watching each other more closely, listening more carefully. Words like resistance and freedom didn't pass through mouths, but they flickered in glances and lingered in the silence that followed every conversation. Mary found himself the center of attention, though not by choice. He had never wanted to be anyone's leader. He only wanted to protect his family and survive with dignity. But now, when he walked to the fields, others followed. When he paused to speak with the elders or the craftsmen, people leaned in. He could feel their hopes weighing on him, and it made him uneasy. They were waiting for something more, something big, something permanent, and he didn't yet know if he could give it. One evening, a small group of farmers gathered outside Mary's home, not for advice, but for answers. There was Jedu, who had lost a brother to temple labor and never seen him again. Kassa, a quiet widow whose eldest son had been conscripted just before the last flood. And Bisu, a former guard who had abandoned his post after watching a man beaten for coughing during prayer. Each had their own reasons. Each had their own anger. They didn't talk loudly. They didn't chant or call for war. But the questions they asked were heavy and hard. How much longer do we bow to the gods that never speak back? What if they come again and don't leave this time? Will standing once be enough? Mary had no answers. He listened. That was all he could do. And though they didn't press him for more, their eyes stayed on him as they left, eyes that said everything without saying anything at all. Hika, the young scribe, remained in the granary camp even after Neebmekit returned to Wazit. His official excuse was that he'd been assigned to reorganize temple inventories. But the truth was that he had stayed because he couldn't forget what he'd seen. Mary's defiance had shaken something loose inside him, something he hadn't even known was caged. Now, he kept a second set of records, not the ones he turned into the priests, but the ones he hid in a hollowed brick behind the storeroom wall. Records of overworked men, missing children, extra quotas, bribes, punishments. He knew it was dangerous, but he couldn't stop. Every time he heard another lie, another excuse offered by the temple for why food was taken from starving mouths, he etched the truth a little deeper into clay. But his eyes weren't the only ones watching. Neebmekit had not forgotten the embarrassment. He had been mocked quietly by other scribes, called soft, weak, too lenient. A temple scribe was supposed to crush rebellion before it could root, and he had walked away from a camp that now buzzed with disobedience. So he made inquiries. He sent letters to the high priest in Wazit, painting the situation as a potential outbreak of sedition. He emphasized the need for swift, symbolic correction. He knew that if he waited too long, his own standing could be jeopardized, and the temple did not like threats to its power. A new order was issued, quiet, indirect, cloaked in ritual language. An inspection team would be sent across the southern Nile work camps to observe spiritual discipline and agricultural compliance. But everyone knew what it meant. They were preparing to re-establish control. And this time, they would come more prepared. Back in the village, Asha had grown worried. Though Mary said little, she saw the way he watched the road at dusk, the way he listened more than spoke, the way he avoided the center of the village market, where gossip always spread fastest. She had known this man since they were children, known his strength, his stubbornness, his heart. But now she saw something else. The weight of expectation. The fear that whatever they'd started was bigger than what they could carry. One night, after the children had gone to sleep, she sat beside him by the fire. He was sharpening a sickle, slowly, not for harvest, but for the feel of it in his hand. "They'll come again," she said. He nodded. "And if they take you?" "I don't know." She took the sickle from his hand and set it aside. "Then don't face them alone." Her voice was steady. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, that she wasn't afraid to be part of what came next, that the fight wasn't just his. Elsewhere, in another village across the Nile, a man named Pharaoh had begun speaking publicly against the temple taxes. He was bold, loud, and unlike Mary, he wanted to be heard. But boldness was dangerous. One night he vanished. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, just a house left quiet and cold, with a pot of lentils still warm on the fire. The next day, temple guards arrived, reminding the villagers to stay faithful, to respect divine order, to pray harder. The message was clear. When news of Pharaoh's disappearance reached Mary's village, it spread faster than any flood. Some took it as a warning, others as a call. Hapu was one of them. He came to Mary the same evening, holding a carved wooden whistle, one used by workers to signal in emergencies. "When it happens," he said, "we won't have time to talk." Mary nodded. He took the whistle and held it in his hand for a long time after Hapu left. The weight of it felt heavier than it should. The next few days passed in a tense stillness. The sky grew overcast. A rare spring wind carried dust from the east, coating the village in a thin film. The goats were restless. The children stopped playing near the river. People felt something shifting, like the moment before a storm when the air turns thick and the trees go quiet. And then came the smoke. It was just before dawn when it rose on the northern edge of the horizon. Not a fire from cooking, not a village hearth. This was bigger, wider, controlled. A signal. Mary was already dressed when Asha came out of the house, breath shallow, hands trembling. He held her gaze. "It's begun." She nodded. "Then go." And with nothing but his sandals, the whistle, and the fire of 1,000 harvests behind him, Mary walked into the gray light, not knowing if he would return, but knowing that what had started in silence could not be silenced again. Mary moved quickly along the narrow dirt path that followed the edge of the irrigation canal, his feet slapping against the packed earth, the whistle hidden inside his palm. The smoke rising in the distance had changed. What began as a thin line now curled like a black ribbon, wide and angry, stretching higher with every gust of wind. Something was burning, but whether it was a storehouse, a field, or a village, he didn't know. And that uncertainty was the most terrifying part of all. As he passed through the outer fields, other figures emerged from the morning haze. Hapu was already there, along with 4 others, Bisu, Cass's son, and 2 men from a neighboring farm. None of them spoke right away. They just looked toward the north, where the horizon was choked in smoke. Each of them wore the same expression, tense, determined, and resigned. "It's the fishers' camp," Hapu finally said. "I saw the guards heading that way in the dark. They've accused them of hoarding grain again." "They always say that," Bisu muttered, "even when it's not true." "It's never true," Cass's son said bitterly. "They take half the fish from the net before it hits the boat." Mary turned his gaze back toward the road. "How many soldiers?" "A dozen. Maybe more," Hapu answered. "Not the temple guards this time. These ones wore different colors." Mary's jaw tightened. That meant they weren't just scribes enforcing quotas anymore. These were soldiers from Wazit, the Central Command, the kind that didn't ask questions or offer warnings. They were here for one reason: control. The men stood there for a moment longer, all waiting for someone else to say what they were already thinking. Then Mary slowly pulled the wooden whistle from his waist sash and raised it to his lips. A single sharp note cut through the morning air. It wasn't loud enough to wake a city, but for those who knew its meaning, for the laborers scattered through the villages, along the canals, across the hidden trails, it was louder than thunder. It meant that the time had come, that this wasn't a moment to wait or hide. It was a call to stand. They moved as one. They didn't run. They didn't shout. But like water flowing back into a riverbed, men and women began appearing from behind trees, from hut doors, from dry gullies and clay walls. Some held tools, hoes, staffs, sharpened sticks. Others carried nothing at all, just their hands, their hunger, and a fire that had lived quietly inside them for far too long. By the time they reached the edge of the fishers' camp, it was chaos. Smoke clung low to the ground, heavy and acrid. One of the storage sheds had collapsed inward, its frames scorched and blackened. Soldiers moved through the camp like dogs in a chicken yard, shoving, shouting, dragging people by their tunics. One young boy sat on the ground crying, his face streaked with ash. An older woman knelt beside him, shielding him with her body as a guard barked orders in a voice already hoarse from shouting. Mary saw it all in an instant. This wasn't an inspection. It was punishment. He stepped forward. The others followed. A soldier turned, saw the crowd forming at the edge of the road, and raised his weapon. Go back. This does not concern you. But they didn't stop. Mary raised his hand, not to strike, not to resist, but simply to speak. They are farmers, not thieves, he said, loud and clear. They feed this land. They've done nothing wrong. The soldier sneered. You're interfering with a royal order. Mary's voice didn't rise. We're standing in the only order that ever mattered, honesty. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Behind the soldiers, one of the guards hesitated. He looked young, nervous. He didn't move his spear, and his eyes flicked toward the villagers forming a human wall across the path. That flicker was all it took. In a breath, the balance shifted. More villagers stepped out from behind huts and brush. The air filled with the rustle of footsteps and low voices. No weapons raised. No rocks thrown. Just presence. Dozens of them. Then more. Silent. Watching. Refusing to leave. One of the soldiers raised a torch. Mary stepped between him and the next hut. If you burn it, he said calmly, you burn us too. The soldier hesitated. For a moment, his grip loosened. Then a voice from behind the troops cut through the smoke, louder than all the others. Enough! A figure pushed through the lines of soldiers. Not another fighter, but a man in priest's robes. His headdress was formal, his scroll case marked with the seal of Wazit. But his face was hard and impatient, and his mouth curled into a frown as he looked over the gathering crowd. What is the meaning of this? He demanded. Why is the entire district on the verge of mutiny? No one answered. The silence was thick and tense. He looked directly at Mary. You, the priest said, are you the one behind this disorder? Mary didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The crowd behind him spoke for him in the stillness. No chanting, no threats, just steady, human resistance. The priest looked around again, and for the first time, he seemed to realize that violence wouldn't win this. Not easily, not without blood, and not without witnesses. He turned to the lead soldier. Withdraw. Return to your post. The camp is under review, not under siege. The soldier stiffened. But the orders have changed, the priest snapped. A breath passed, and then, slowly, the soldier stepped back. Mary didn't move. He didn't smile. He simply waited, watched as they disappeared down the trail, leaving behind a mess of ash, broken pottery, and fear. When they were gone, people exhaled. The tension began to break. Mothers pulled their children close. Men patted each other's backs. Some wept quietly, not from pain, but from the strange relief of not being destroyed. Mary turned to face them all. We're not finished, he said quietly. This won't be the last time they come. But no one looked away. They had stood once, and they would again. Hika would later write that this day, when a village full of workers stood silently against soldiers and refused to move, was the moment the old order truly began to fracture. Not with swords or banners, but with courage that did not raise its voice. And while the temples still held their scrolls, and the pharaohs still ruled from afar, somewhere deep in the dust of the Nile Valley, the idea of obedience began to rot. Not from fire, but from truth. That evening, the fishers' camp was quiet. The flames had long since died down, leaving behind smoldering beams and the heavy smell of burnt grain. But the people, though bruised, shaken, and tired, were still there. No one had fled. No one had run for the hills or turned against one another. Instead, they moved like a single body, helping each other clean up what little was left. Men rebuilt with cracked hands. Women used torn shawls to wrap children's wounds. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Mary sat on a block of sun-warmed limestone, staring at the blackened ruins and thinking. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel powerful. He only felt tired. Asha arrived not long after dusk, walking with careful steps through the crowd until she found him. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. The soot on his arms, the scratch on his neck, the tight way he held his jaw, it all said enough. "They burned the food?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Half of it. Maybe more." She sat beside him and took his hand, letting the silence stretch between them. Around them, someone began singing a lullaby. The tune was old. One Mary remembered his mother humming when he was a boy, but it had never sounded so sad or so strong. "They're going to come back," he said finally, with better excuses, with more force. Asha tightened her fingers around his. "And when they do, we'll still be here," he said. She smiled faintly. Then maybe that's enough. But Mary wasn't sure. He could feel something shifting again, deep and slow, like the ground preparing for a tremor. What happened that day would not go unnoticed. The priest may have withdrawn the soldiers, but it wasn't a surrender. It was a pause, and pauses in Egypt rarely lasted long. In the coming days, more word arrived from neighboring villages. People had heard about the stand at the fishers' camp. Some called it foolish, others called it brave. But most agreed on one thing: something had changed. In one village, farmers refused to surrender their cattle for temple rituals. In another, scribes were turned away by a wall of silent workers who simply stared at them until they left. The stories multiplied like wind-blown seed, planting unrest in places where obedience had once been instinct. In the granary camp, Hika copied it all down. His private scroll had grown too large to hide behind a single wall. He now kept fragments stored in hollowed-out jars beneath the floor of an abandoned storehouse. Each one held a record, a name, a date, a place. He documented every resistance, every whisper of refusal. He knew he was creating something dangerous. But every time he saw a guard raise a staff or a priest twist the truth to take more than what was fair, his hand became steadier. One morning, while inspecting the ledger scrolls, Hika overheard two temple overseers speaking in hushed tones near the courtyard. "There's talk in Wazit," one said, "about uprisings in the south. Priests don't want another mess like this one. They're blaming the scribes. And if it spreads, they'll make an example of someone." Hika returned to his quarters and sat for a long time, staring at his records. He didn't have power, not in the way the temples did, but he had something else, proof. And now he had a decision to make. Back in Mary's village, the rebuilding continued. The people didn't wait for permission. They shared tools, food, ideas. Children were taught by the elders in the shade of sycamores. Scribes didn't return, and when messengers passed through with orders, they were met with empty eyes and no answers. The village had found its own way of surviving now, one that didn't rely on the temple. One evening, Mary stood at the edge of his field, watching the last light fall across rows of newly planted barley. It wasn't a large harvest. It wouldn't be enough to trade or store, but it was honest. It was his, and it was growing. He heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Hika approaching, dressed plainly, without his scribe's seal. "You walked far," Mary said. "I had to," Hika replied. "I've come to give you something." He handed Mary a sealed clay jar. "What's in it?" Mary asked, turning it over in his hands. "Names. Stories. Yours. Others. It's not finished yet, but it's real." Mary looked at the jar, then back at the young man. Why give it to me? Because you were the first one to speak when no one else would, Hekis said. And because the priests will come looking for me soon. They'll know I've been writing what they don't want written. Mary was silent for a moment. Then he placed a hand on Hekis' shoulder. You're not alone. I know, Hekis said. But if I disappear, someone needs to have the truth. That night, Mary buried the jar beneath the roots of the oldest tree in the village, a tamarisk that had stood since before his grandfather's time. He marked the spot with a stone and said nothing to anyone. In the weeks that followed, the quiet resistance spread like the Nile itself, slow, winding, and impossible to contain. Not every village stood. Some still bowed. Some still feared. But the idea had been planted. And once an idea takes root, not even fire can burn it away completely. Mary returned to his days in the field, to his children's laughter, to the sound of frogs in the reeds and the feel of wind across his back. He still looked over his shoulder, still listened for boots on the path. But in his heart, something had settled. He didn't know how the story would end, but he knew that, for the first time in his life, he had helped start one worth telling. The heat returned earlier than usual that year, creeping into the valley like something that didn't care to ask permission. By mid-morning, sweat clung to the farmer's skin before the first tool touched the dirt. The barley Mary had planted was growing, slowly, stubbornly, but the ground around it was dry. Too dry. The canals hadn't been dredged yet. The water that once flowed without effort now trickled like a fading memory. People spoke in short sentences and quiet tones. There was tension in the air that didn't come from the sun. Mary noticed how the village had started to change again, not with celebration, but with caution. Those who had once stood proudly at his side now looked both ways before entering his home. Visitors arrived at night, left before dawn. Even Hapu, who never worried about anything, had begun sleeping with a stick beside his bed. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the kind that warned of something coming, and Mary could feel it too. He tried to focus on the fields, on the simple rhythm of digging, planting, covering, moving. He told himself to stay present, to not feed fear. But every broken reed, every shadow at the edge of the trees, every figure walking along the road made his chest tighten. The temple hadn't forgotten what happened. They had just waited. That's what frightened him most. The quiet from Wazit didn't feel like surrender. It felt like planning. Then, one evening, a boy arrived breathless at Mary's door, his face pale and his feet cut from running. They're coming, he panted. From the west road. Soldiers. 2 carts. More than before. Mary stood still for a long second. His hand reached for the doorway, not to steady himself, but to ground himself. Did they say why? They didn't have to, the boy whispered. Within an hour, word had spread across the village like a wildfire racing through dry grass. People didn't scream or run. They didn't need to. They simply moved, gathering their children, hiding what little food they had, burying scrolls, slipping coins into folds of cloth. The memories of the burned fishers' camp were still fresh. And now it was their turn. Asha walked into their home and began packing small things without a word. She didn't ask if they would fight. She didn't ask if they would leave. She only packed, fast and quiet. What will they want this time? She finally asked. Control, Mary said. Maybe to make an example. Asha's eyes darkened. Then they'll choose you. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. That night, the wind shifted again. The animals were restless. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal howled, an eerie, broken sound that seemed to echo forever. The village kept its lamps low. People didn't sleep, but no one opened their doors either. It felt like the entire valley was holding its breath. And just before dawn, they arrived. 2 carts, just like the boy said. Soldiers in uniforms that didn't belong to any nearby town. Spears, shields, a banner bearing the temple symbol, but no scribes this time. No announcements. They didn't enter with ceremony. They didn't explain. They just walked in, one step at a time, slow and heavy, like they already knew what they were going to do. Mary stood near the well, waiting. They came to him first. One of them, taller than the rest, had a leather scroll case tied to his belt. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't raise his voice. He just pointed. You're Mary, he said flatly. I am. You've been spreading sedition. You've been named in multiple temple reports. Mary didn't blink. I've been telling the truth. The soldier didn't flinch. That's not how the temple sees it. Around them, villagers began to gather, slowly, carefully. No weapons, no shouting, just presence. Women held their children back. Men stood with arms crossed, tools in hand. No one moved, but everyone was watching. Another soldier stepped forward, holding a set of bindings. His hand trembled just slightly. "You're being taken to Wazit," the tall one said. "You'll be judged there." "On what grounds?" "Defiance, incitement, theft of temple grain, encouraging rebellion." "I didn't steal grain." "It doesn't matter. Someone said you did." Mary looked past them, at his people, at Asha standing at the edge of the crowd with her mouth tight and her fists clenched. He saw the same faces that had worked beside him for years. Quiet men, tired mothers, boys who'd never had shoes, girls who knew how to dig channels before they learned to write their names. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. "If you take me," he said, voice low but steady, "you take them too. Because everything I've done with them. They've seen it. They've lived it. Every cut, every empty bowl, every beating. If I'm guilty, so are they." The soldier shifted. The tall one's eyes narrowed. "You're making this worse for yourself." "No," Mary said. "You did that when you let children starve and called it balance." The crowd murmured now. Not loud, but loud enough. The soldier raised a hand. But before the order came, a second figure stepped forward from the back of the crowd. It was Hika, dressed not in robes, but in plain clothes, dusty from travel. "I have records," he said, voice shaking but clear. "I was there. I wrote it all. What Mary says is true. What the temple did, it's all in writing. The taxes, the punishments, the threats." The tall soldier hesitated. "You're a scribe?" "I was," Hika said. "Now I'm a witness." The man looked between Hika and Mary and the crowd behind them, still growing, still silent. The village had risen, not with violence, but with unity. And the soldiers, once sure of their control, now stood surrounded, not by force, but by truth. Mary knew something was going to happen. The moment stretched too long. The commander's hand hovered. The bindings shook. The eyes of the people burned. A decision was about to be made, one that would decide whether this story ended with blood or with something else. And in that final breath before action, before any order was given or resisted, the whole village waited. Even the wind stopped. A single word could have shattered the stillness. A hand signal, a snap of leather. One shouted order from the commander would have turned the quiet into chaos, into screaming, into tears, into blood in the dirt. But none of that came. Instead, the commander lowered his hand. His expression didn't soften. He didn't offer mercy or understanding. But he looked, really looked, at the crowd, at the children half hidden behind legs, at the worn-down elders standing as tall as their spines would allow, at the farmers who weren't armed, but who stood anyway. He turned back to Mary. "This doesn't end here," he said, voice flat. Mary nodded. "Nothing ever does." The commander jerked his head toward the road. "We're leaving. For now." The soldiers shifted. One of them started to speak, but the commander silenced him with a glance. Slowly, uncertainly, they began to retreat, back through the village, down the path they'd arrived on, spears still gripped, but no longer raised. And just like that, they were gone. No cheer rose from the villagers. No one danced or clapped or praised the gods. This was not joy. It was survival. It was breathing after being underwater too long. It was knowing that you had only postponed the storm, not outrun it. Mary didn't move for a long time. He stood rooted where he had been, the sweat drying on his face, the dust still clinging to his arms. He didn't feel relief. He felt the weight of responsibility settle even deeper on his chest. Hika stepped forward, his hand still holding a small leather pouch. "I thought they'd take me too," he said quietly. "They still might," Mary replied. "Later, when no one's watching. Then I'll keep moving." Mary turned to him. "You could go north, toward the mines, or west, across the river. They don't have scribes there. They don't have much of anything." Hika shook his head. "No, I'll go where the stories are." That evening, the village gathered again, this time by the old tamarisk tree. No fire, no singing, Just people sitting close, shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same heavy night air. Someone passed around a jar of dates. Someone else shared old barley cakes. No one spoke about what had almost happened. No one needed to. They had all felt it. Asha sat beside Mary, her fingers laced with his. The children had fallen asleep in her lap, too tired to fight off the lull of the crickets and the comfort of their mother's arms. "You should have let them take you," she whispered at one point. Not as an accusation, but as a plea. "You could have survived it." "I don't want to survive it," he said. "I wanted to stop." She didn't answer, but she didn't let go of his hand. Over the next few days, the village fell back into rhythm. Fields were watered. Chickens chased bugs through the reeds. Babies cried. Dogs barked. Life, messy, unglamorous, beautiful, continued. But something had changed beneath the surface. News of the incident spread again. This time, it reached even further. Villages miles away began sending quiet messages, bundles of grain, letters scratched into palm leaves, small tokens of solidarity. One scroll, passed through 5 sets of hands before it arrived, bore a single phrase, "We are still standing, too." And Mary began to understand what they had done. They hadn't overthrown the temple. They hadn't burned any palaces or toppled any statues. But they had planted something stronger than rebellion. An idea that the workers had worth, that they weren't invisible, that even in silence they could speak. And that truth, once seen, could not be unseen. Hika eventually moved on. One morning, Mary found his quarters empty, the cot neatly rolled, the small reed pens missing. But in the center of the table was a sealed jar. Inside were copies, stories, testimonies, names, dates, and one line etched along the lid. Asterisk, keep this safe. It's yours now. Asterisk. Mary buried the jar beside the first, under the same tamarisk tree. Years passed. The Nile rose and fell. Floods came and went. Some harvests were lean, others generous. The temples still ruled. The priests still demanded. But never again did the soldiers come to Mary's village. They called it cursed, unruly, spiritually defiant. They sent scribes from time to time, but the scribes left quickly and often returned without full reports. Children grew into workers. Elders passed on their tools and their stories. And every season, just after the planting, the village gathered beneath the old tree, no longer to mourn or wait for punishment, but to remember. They remembered a time when it sucked to be a farmer in ancient Egypt, not just because of the labor or the heat or the hunger, but because they were made to believe they were small, replaceable, forgotten. But now they knew better. Now they knew that even the lowest farmer, even the poorest family, even the quietest voice could push back. And that maybe someday someone would uncover the buried jars, read the names, and realize that history was not just the story of kings and gods. It was the story of those who stood, of those who stayed, of those who refused to bow. And somewhere in the dusty corners of forgotten temples, a whisper still lingers, passed from one tired worker to another. Mary stood. So can you. Weeks passed, and the calm held. The fields ripened under the sun, and the village settled into a rhythm that almost felt normal again. There was a cautious peace in the air, something fragile but welcome. Yet, underneath the routine of planting, harvesting, and mending tools, there was a tension Mary couldn't shake. It was like standing on dry ground while sensing a flood beneath the surface. People still spoke in lower voices. They still avoided traveling too far from the village. And sometimes at night, when the wind shifted just right, Mary swore he could hear something distant, like hooves on hardened dirt or the soft hum of chants carried from faraway temples. Then came the twist no one saw coming. It began with a single cart. Dust rose in the distance, thin as thread, slowly unraveling across the horizon. At first, the villagers assumed it was a trader or perhaps a wandering priest. But as the cart drew closer, they saw no driver, no oxen. It was being pulled by men, 5 of them barefoot, sunburnt, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Strapped to the back of the cart was something wrapped in linen. A body. Mary was the first to step forward. The lead man collapsed at his feet. His lips were cracked. His voice rasped with every word. They took her, he said. The village gathered around as more men stumbled behind the cart. One of them held a broken wooden tablet, its seal half-burned. Another clutched what looked like part of a torn banner. The wrapped body wasn't a stranger. It was Cass's son. His face had been bruised beyond recognition, but the ring on his finger confirmed it. They came at night, another man said. Not soldiers this time. Not priests. Masked men. No symbols. No warnings. They asked for the records. Mary's heart dropped. He knew what they meant. Hika's scrolls. The ones they thought were safe. Buried. Hidden. Protected. But someone had found them. Or worse, someone had talked. The crowd stood frozen as the men told their story. Their own village had resisted, quietly, just as Mary's had. They had shared food with outcasts, refused an unfair temple census, and passed along the scrolls copied from Hika's notes. But then one day, their well dried up. Then the taxes doubled. Then the officials stopped showing up, only to be replaced by masked enforcers who moved without law and without names. It wasn't the temple. It wasn't the Pharaoh's soldiers. It was something else. They're not trying to control anymore, the man whispered. They're trying to erase. Mary felt the weight in his chest return. The same pressure he had felt the first day he defied a temple guard. But this was different, more calculated, more violent, and more invisible. The peace had been a trap. The village buried Cass's son beside the tamarisk tree. No songs were sung, no speeches made, only the steady beat of fists on hearts as each person passed the grave. It was a sign of mourning, yes, but also of warning, and of readiness. That night, Mary met with Hapu, Asha, and the oldest elders in the quiet of the granary. Asha laid out what they all feared to say aloud. The scrolls were no longer just a record. They were a threat. They don't want obedience anymore, she said. They want silence. Then what do we do? Hapu asked. Burn the scrolls? Hide them further? No, Mary said. We do the one thing they're most afraid of. Asha looked at him. We speak. There was a moment of stillness. Then one of the elders shook his head. If you spread those stories now, they won't send soldiers. They'll send ghosts. That's why we do it now, Mary replied. While we still can. The next day, 3 runners left the village. One toward the east, one downriver, one to the northern fields near Wayzat's border. They carried nothing but their feet, their memories, and a new copy of the records. One condensed scroll made of rough papyrus, inked with care, sealed with no names. The message was clear. The old stories are being erased. Learn them before they're gone. But Mary knew they were racing time, and their enemies were no longer visible. That same evening, a woman arrived in the village. She wore traveling robes, face veiled, sandals cracked from the road. She asked for Mary by name. When he met her by the well, she removed the veil. It was Hika's sister. He was taken 2 weeks ago, she said. Mary felt the words hit him like a hammer. He kept writing, she continued. He refused to leave the province. Said it wasn't about safety. Said he had more to finish. Mary swallowed hard. Do you know where they took him? She nodded. The stone house. The one west of the river bend. The old jail. Mary turned his gaze westward. That building hadn't been used in years. Not officially, but stories had always swirled around it. About disappearances, about screams that never reached the villages, about men who entered and never walked back out. Why do they keep him alive? Asha asked. Hika's sister answered without hesitation. Because he never gave them what they wanted. It wasn't just about scrolls anymore, or crops, or quotas. It was about fear. Fear of history being remembered correctly. Fear of truth being carried in the hands of the people, instead of locked behind temple walls. And now the question pressed into Mary's mind like a blade. How far would they go to silence a farmer? A scribe? A village? Or all of Egypt? The stars rose over the tamarisk tree that night, quiet and cold. And Mary knew the flood wasn't coming. It had already begun. The night after Hika's sister came, the village did not sleep. Mary stood under the tamarisk tree long after the moon had risen, watching the branches sway gently in the breeze. The soft rustle of leaves, once comforting, now sounded like whispers he couldn't quite understand. Asha stood beside him, arms folded, her eyes locked on the horizon. "They'll kill him," she said softly. Mary didn't answer. "They want the records. The names. If he hasn't talked yet, they'll keep trying. And if he never does—" Her voice trailed off. "They'll make sure no one else ever hears his story," Mary finished. A long silence followed. Then she turned to him. "So what are you going to do?" "I'm going to get him." He expected her to protest, to beg him not to go, but she only nodded, as if she'd already known his answer before he spoke it. Asha had never been the kind to stand behind when things turned dangerous. "I'll speak to the others," she said. "They'll want to help." "No," he said. "Not yet. I can't ask them to risk everything again. Not after what happened with Cass's son." "You're not asking," she said. "They'll come because they believe in what this is." Mary met her eyes. They were steady, fierce, the same eyes that had once watched him walk into a fight alone and had never let him do it again. By morning, there were 6 of them: Mary, Hapu, Asha, Hika's sister, Bisu, and a young boy named Nun who had grown into a strong, fast-footed man with a sharp eye and quiet courage. Each one carried only what they needed: a water skin, a blade, a handful of dried figs. They traveled at dawn, when the sun was just peeking over the hills and the light still had a softness to it that hadn't yet burned. The journey to the stone house took 2 days. They moved along old goat paths and through narrow ravines, avoiding the main road. The fields they passed were mostly abandoned or poorly tended, signs that temple influence had stretched thin or been replaced by fear. At one point, they came across a village completely empty. Not destroyed, not burned, just gone. The houses were still standing, the baskets still hanging, even tools left resting against doorways. But no people, no animals, no noise. "They're not just silencing people," Bisu murmured. "They're erasing them." On the second night, they camped near a dried riverbed under a cluster of acacia trees. Asha sat sharpening her blade, while Mary ran a finger over the map drawn in the dirt by Hika's sister. "The stone house is just west of the bend," she said. "1 level above ground. 2 below. They keep prisoners underground." "Guards?" Mary asked. She nodded. "Always at least 4. Maybe more now." Nun looked up from where he was crouched, tying his sandals. "There's a way in from the rear. A crack in the wall near the dry channel. I saw it years ago when I was hunting lizards. They won't be watching it." Mary considered it. "If we go in quiet, we don't need to fight. And if we do?" Hapu asked. "Then we don't fight to win," Mary said. "We fight to get out." They set out before dawn, moving like shadows between the rocks and low shrubs. When they reached the edge of the hill overlooking the stone house, they dropped to their bellies and peered down. It was smaller than Mary expected, more like a forgotten temple storehouse than a prison. Square, weathered, walls the color of old bone. 2 guards out front, resting lazily under a patch of shade. Another walked the roof, slowly, half asleep. No movement from within, just the thick silence of secrets. None led them down the slope, staying close to the earth. Around the eastern side, he found a crack just as he'd remembered it, half covered in dry brush and just wide enough to crawl through. One by one, they slipped inside. The stone was cold and damp. The walls smelled of mildew and blood. They found the stairwell quickly, a narrow spiral leading downward into complete darkness. Mary led the way, torch in hand, blade drawn. Each step echoed with eerie patience, like the building itself was listening. At the bottom, they came to a corridor with 4 cells, small, iron-barred, lit only by a faint slit of morning light from above. In the last cell, curled in the corner, was Hika. He looked thinner, paler. His robes were torn, his face bruised. But when the torchlight hit him, his eyes fluttered open, and he smiled. "You're late," he whispered. Mary didn't respond. He simply knelt and touched Hika's shoulder. Asha made quick work of the lock with a carved bone pick. Within seconds, the door creaked open. Hika stumbled into Mary's arms. "They wanted the names," he said. "They knew I was copying them. They found the one in the temple courtyard. But I didn't speak." "We know," Mary said. They had almost reached the stairwell when the alarm sounded, a sharp horn blast from above, followed by shouts. Then spun around. "We've been seen." "Back through the crack," Mary ordered. "Now!" They ran. Hika's arm was over Mary's shoulder. Hapu took the rear. Asha and Bisu pushed ahead to clear the way. Arrows hit the walls, bouncing off stone. A torch was thrown into the hallway behind them. Fire licked the darkness. Then came a clash of boots. Guards! Close! Too close. None reached the crack first and slipped through. Asha followed, dragging Hika's sister. Mary pushed Hika ahead and turned to cover him just as a guard lunged from the corner. They struggled, dust flying, limbs slamming into stone. Mary caught the man's wrist, shoved his blade away, then drove his elbow into the guard's chest. Bisu grabbed Mary's tunic. Go! They burst through the crack just as more guards rounded the bend, shouting in fury. Outside, the group scrambled over the dry channel, arrows zipping past their heads. One scraped Mary's arm. Another hit Hapu's leg, but he didn't fall. He only limped faster. By the time they reached the trees, the shouting had faded. They didn't stop until dusk, and when they did, they collapsed in silence. Hika looked up at the sky through a tear in the canopy and laughed. A tired, broken laugh that somehow still held joy. You came for me, he said. Mary nodded. You kept the story alive. We couldn't let it end with you. Hika reached into his ragged belt and pulled out a scroll. Thin, barely intact, ink smudged. They didn't get all of it, he said. Asha leaned against the tree beside him, her eyes scanning the woods. Then it's not over. No, Mary said. It's just beginning. Because now, the records weren't just stories. They were proof that truth could survive anything, even silence, even fear, even time. They moved under cover of darkness for the next 2 nights, following dry gullies and deer tracks to stay off the open roads. Hika was weak but determined, and he insisted on walking as far as his legs would carry him. When he couldn't, Nun and Bisu took turns supporting him without complaint. There was no time to rest. The escape had shaken the quiet rebellion loose again, and everyone in the group knew the response from Wazit would be swift and merciless. By the 3rd morning, they reached the edge of their valley. The tamarisk tree was just visible in the distance, its long branches swaying like arms waiting to welcome them home. The sun crept over the fields, revealing what they hadn't seen in the night. People. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Not just from their own village, but from others. Faces Mary recognized from long-ago harvests. Faces he didn't know at all. They weren't working. They were waiting. Word had spread. Somehow, faster than the wind itself, the people had heard what had happened. About the raid, the escape, the truth being hunted down and smothered. They had gathered not with pitchforks or banners, but with their presence. Quiet, watchful, ready. Asha slowed as they approached the first row of farmers. They're not just waiting for us, she whispered. They're waiting to decide what happens next. Mary looked at Hika, who stood upright now, breath shallow but steady. He still held the scroll close to his chest, as if it were his heartbeat. Mary stepped forward, past the villagers, into the center of the dry field. He turned to face the crowd. No one asked for this, he said, voice low but carrying. We didn't plan to start something. We only wanted to be heard. A few murmurs passed through the crowd. But they're not just punishing us anymore. They're punishing the idea that we can speak, that we can remember, that we matter. He lifted his arm, gesturing to Hika. They took him because he told the truth. They heard him because he kept our names alive. And now they will come for any of us who don't go back to silence. Silence swept over the field. But I will not be silent again, Mary said. Not even if they come with fire. Not even if they call us traitors. Because if we don't speak now, they will rewrite us out of the world. From the crowd, a woman stepped forward. She was older, her gray hair wrapped in a faded scarf. She didn't say anything. She simply opened her palm and revealed a small, folded piece of parchment, a copied fragment of Hika's scrolls. Then another man stepped forward, holding a chipped jar. Then another, with a strip of linen, inked with a name. Each carried a piece of the truth. Hika's voice cracked with emotion. You copied them? The woman nodded. We all did. Every village that got a scroll made more. A second voice chimed in. Even the ones you thought were lost. We passed it by word when we had no paper. Bisu stared at them, wide-eyed. They didn't silence it. Asha whispered, stunned. They multiplied it. Hika sat down hard in the dirt and laughed, the sound edged with disbelief. We were never the resistance, he said. They are. The crowd was no longer just a gathering. It was a movement, not coordinated, not armed, but real, grown in silence, fed by hardship, protected by those who had nothing but truth. Mary stepped back, his heart pounding. What do we do now? Hapu asked, and the answer came, not from Mary, not from Hika, but from a boy, barely older than 10, who stood near the front of the crowd with a reed pen tucked behind his ear. We write more, he said. That evening, they held a gathering under the tamarisk tree. But it wasn't like before. There was no fear. There was no whispering. People spoke openly, telling stories of how their families had hidden messages, saved scraps of parchment, carved words in old wood. One farmer had even baked fragments into clay pots to hide among the market stalls. And slowly a plan formed. Not of war, not of rebellion, of memory. Each village would continue writing. Not just the injustices, but the names, the work, the births, the weather, the songs, the deaths, the meals, everything that made them real, everything that could be erased. If the temples had scrolls of gods and kings, the people would have scrolls of themselves. Hika began teaching again, this time in the open. Children sat in circles around him, scratching letters in his sand before they ever held ink. Men learned to copy phrases on a bark. Women stitched records in a cloth. Asha organized messengers, runners who would carry the scrolls between settlements, never taking the same route twice. Then built hiding places in stone walls, behind wells, beneath trees with twisted roots. And Mary? Mary watched over it all. He still tended his field, still mended tools, still walked the canal paths at sunrise. But now, everywhere he went, someone handed him a scroll, or a name, or a story, and he kept them all. Under the tamarisk tree, the scrolls were no longer buried. They were stored in clay jars, stacked carefully in the shade, marked with simple carvings. Asterisk, people of the dust. Asterisk, the temple never came again. Maybe they knew that the story had gotten too big. Or maybe they realized that fear could only carry their silence so far. Or maybe, just maybe, they had begun to sense what Mary had always believed deep in his bones. That even the smallest voice, repeated enough times, could outlast 1,000 walls. And many years later, when the tamarisk tree finally fell, its trunk hollow from age and ants, the people built a small shelter in its place. Not a temple, not a shrine, just a roof to protect the jars and the stories within them. And carved above the entrance, in letters worn smooth by wind and time, were the words that had started it all. We are still standing. And they were. Years passed quietly, and the valley became known as a place where truth lived in ink and memory. Villagers still whispered the name Mary, and children grew up learning letters before they learned to count seeds. The clay jars beneath the shelter kept multiplying, filled with names, stories, births, failures, joys, and droughts. Some jars came from so far away that no one even knew the villages they had traveled through. Still, the shelter remained open, unlocked, unguarded. There was no need for weapons, only words. But peace, even slow and careful, can't last forever. One late afternoon, when the sun painted the valley gold, a figure appeared at the edge of the fields. He walked alone, dust coating his robes, a staff in one hand. He looked like any other traveler, but Mary noticed something different. It was in the way the man's eyes swept the village, not as a visitor, but as someone measuring it, calculating. Mary approached with his usual calm. "You come a long way," he said. The man didn't smile. "I've come to speak." So they sat, the stranger on a stone, Mary in the dirt. The children ran nearby, shouting and chasing beetles. Asha watched from the grain shed. She didn't trust silence when it came from strangers. "You're Mary," the man said. "The farmer. The one they warned us about. I'm just a man who didn't forget things. But they say you changed Egypt." "I didn't. Egypt changed herself. We just refused to stay quiet." The man lowered his hood. He was younger than he seemed. Eyes sharp, mouth tight. Not a priest. Not a soldier. Something in between. There's a new priesthood rising, he said. They've uncovered the old records. Some of your scrolls. Your truth. Mary said nothing. They say your records conflict with the royal archive, that your stories undermine the God's order. Mary nodded slowly. Because our stories are real, not carved by the wealthy, just lived by the rest of us. The man leaned forward. They've sent me to collect them. Which ones? All of them. Mary's heart beat once hard, but his voice stayed calm. They're not mine to give. They say if you hand them over, there won't be punishment. And if I don't, they'll burn the shelter. Take the jars, and you'll be remembered as a liar. Mary stared at the horizon, at the tamarisk saplings sprouting where the old tree once stood. The wind carried the soft rustle of papyrus leaves and children's laughter. No, he said. The man blinked. No, no, Mary repeated. Because if they burn one shelter, 10 more will rise. If they take our scrolls, we'll write them again. If they call us liars, we'll still have truth in our hands. You can't kill a story once it's been told. The man stood slowly. Then you've made your choice. Mary nodded. So have you. But what neither of them expected happened that night. As dusk settled, a group of villagers met quietly near the shelter. They had seen the man leave. They had watched his measured steps, the cold way he observed the children, the fields, the old tools. And before he could return with others, before soldiers could arrive again, they acted. They didn't run. They didn't hide. They packed the scrolls, not in fear, but in strategy. Dozens of villagers, young and old, gathered around the jars. They wrapped the scrolls in wax cloth. Some placed them inside baskets of grain. Others strapped them under carts, painted as trade goods. One woman braided strips of parchment into her hair. They didn't say goodbye. They only nodded at each other, like raindrops falling into the same stream. By midnight, every scroll was gone, scattered across the Nile, hidden in plain sight, carried by hands no one suspected. When a new priesthood arrived 3 days later with fire and threats, they found an empty shelter. Nothing to take, nothing to burn. And just as they turned to leave, defeated and confused, they found a single scroll left in the center of the room. It was new, simple, written in large, steady hand. It said, "Asterisk, we already share the story. You're too late, asterisk." Mary wasn't there when they read it. He had gone to the hills with Asha, sitting on a rocky outcrop with a valley curved and the water shimmered like bronze. She rested her head on his shoulder. Neither spoke for a long while. Then she asked, "Do you think they'll come for us again?" He looked toward the village, then up at the sky. "Maybe, but it doesn't matter now." "Why not?" "Because the story's not ours anymore. It belongs to the people." She smiled. "Then we did it." "No," he said softly. "They did." Just then, a young girl arrived, barefoot, carrying a scroll of her own. She didn't say a word, just handed it to Mary and turned back down the path, vanishing like a breeze. He unrolled the parchment and read the final lines, written in charcoal. Asterisk, they try to silence the farmers, but we remembered anyway. We are the sons of dust, the daughters of rivers. And when they count their kings, we will count our names. Asterisk. That was the twist no one expected. The story didn't end with Mary. It never had. Mary held the scroll in his hands long after the girl had disappeared down the path. The words were still warm from her fingers. Charcoal smudged at the edges, a little crooked in places, as if written quickly or by a hand not yet used to letters. But the message was clear, powerful, honest. He looked at Asha, and she looked back at him. Neither of them said it, but they both felt it. Something had changed, not just in the valley or the villages along the Nile, but in Egypt itself. For generations, history had belonged to those in marble halls and gold-plated tombs. The priests, the generals, the pharaohs. They carved lies into stone and called them truth. But now, scroll by scroll, name by name, the people were reclaiming it. That night, the stars came out sharp and clear, scattered across the sky like tiny fires. Mary and Asha returned to the village just as the children were chasing fireflies in the warm dusk. Hika sat near the shelter, his legs stretched out in front of him, a reed pen behind his ear, watching the sky with tired eyes. "They'll send others," he said without looking up. "They already did," Mary replied. and they found nothing. Hika smiled faintly. I remember when I thought the best I could do was stay alive. Now I'm watching children copy scrolls into dust with their feet. You gave them something worth repeating. They gave it to each other, Hika said. That's stronger than anything I could have written. The next day, a runner arrived from the far south, breathless and soaked in sweat. He carried a basket of dates and a cloth-wrapped scroll. Inside was news. A temple archive had been ransacked, not by looters but by workers, laborers who had demanded to see the ledgers that recorded their debt. When they were refused, they took the scrolls anyway, laid them out in the center of the market, and read them aloud. And for the first time, the scribes didn't stop them. Asha laughed when she heard the story. That's how it spreads. Not in battles. In voices. Mary agreed. It was like fire, yes, but not wild and consuming. It was quiet and steady. Controlled. Passed from hand to hand, voice to voice, like coals carried in clay pots across the desert. In the weeks that followed, more scrolls arrived, each from different villages, written in different handwriting on different materials. Some were parchment, others were bark or linen. A few were scratched into thin pieces of pottery. They told stories of fishers and shepherds, of healers and gravediggers, stories of birth and loss, of small joys, of resistance. Every one of them ended with the same line. We are still standing. Even the children began to understand. Mary watched them one afternoon, sitting in the sun outside the granary, copying letters into soft clay. One girl, barely old enough to tie her sandals, pressed her thumbprint next to her name on the tablet. What's that for? Nan asked her. It means I was here, she said, even if the letters fade. Hika wept when he heard that. Later, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, Mary walked the length of the canal alone. It had always been his place to think, to measure his life in water and earth. He looked at the crops growing in neat rows. The soil was dry, but it held strength. It reminded him of the people. Not loud, not grand, but impossible to break once rooted. He thought about the years behind him, of digging in silence, of fearing each harvest, of the moment he stood before soldiers with nothing but his voice. He thought about the stories they'd saved, not for glory, but so that no one would forget that they existed. And he thought about what came next. He knew the temple would try again, maybe with stronger men, sharper tools, harsher laws, but none of that could change what had already begun. You can kill a man. You can even burn his words. But once 1,000 people remember the same truth, it cannot be undone. He turned back toward the village. The tamarisk saplings had grown tall. Their roots stretched deep, just like the people, just like the story. That night, Mary stood before the villagers and told them a story of his own. It wasn't about battles or priests or even kings. It was about a young boy who once learned to dig trenches beside his father. A boy who hated the heat but loved the feel of the earth in his hands. Who watched injustice like it was weather, always there, too big to fight. And how, one day, he decided to speak. Just once. And everything changed. The people listened quietly. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it was new. But because they could see themselves in every word. And when Mary finished, he handed the scroll to a child, no older than 10. It's yours now, he said. The child blinked, then hugged it to his chest like a treasure. That was how it continued. No fanfare, no armies, just names, passed down like seeds. And long after Mary was gone, and the tamarisk shelter gave way to wind and time, someone would dig through the soil and find a scroll wrapped in worn cloth. And they would read it, and in that moment, they would know. It sucked being a farmer in ancient Egypt. But they stood. They endured. They remembered. And because they remembered, they were never truly gone. Seasons passed like pages in a scroll, and the rhythm of life continued in the valley. Flood, plant, harvest, rest, repeat. Some of the old faces began to fade, called back to the earth they'd always nurtured. Hapu's voice grew quieter, then fell silent. Asha's strong hand slowed, but her eyes never lost their fire. Hika, thin, gray, but still scribbling on anything that would hold ink, spent his last years beneath the tamarisk saplings, teaching the next wave of children how to press memory into something that could outlive them. And Mary? He aged quietly, as farmers often do, sunburnt, wrinkled, and sturdy. His hair went white, his back bent, but his presence remained constant, like the Nile itself. He still walked the canal before sunrise, still tasted the soil to test the moisture, still nodded to strangers as if they were old friends. He had become a story himself. One afternoon, as he rested near the edge of the fields, a young girl sat beside him. She was maybe 8, maybe 9, with a reed pen stuck in her curls and a scrap of papyrus clutched tight in her hands. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Why didn't you ever write your own name down?" Mary looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "In the jars. In the shelter. Everyone else's name is there. All the scribes and the runners. Even the people who just gave food to the messengers. But not yours." He smiled gently, because the story was never mine. She squinted at him, clearly unsatisfied. "But you started it." He shook his head. "I just spoke out loud. It was everyone else who chose to listen. And then they chose to speak, too. But if you hadn't said anything, someone else would have," he interrupted. The soil was ready. The truth just needed a voice. She frowned, then unrolled her scrap of papyrus and handed it to him. It was a poem. Short, clumsy. The letters wobbled like her handwriting didn't yet trust itself. But the meaning was clear. Asterisk he stood in the dust. When others bowed low, he carried no sword, but made the truth grow. Asterisk. He looked up, and her face was serious. "You're already part of the story," she said. "But now it's written." Mary folded the poem and handed it back. "Then you keep it," he said, "and when you tell it again, make it better." She grinned and ran off, sandals kicking up little clouds of dust. Later that night, Mary sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker low. Asha joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "She's right, you know," she said. "You've always been part of the story, whether you wanted to be or not." "I never wanted to be remembered," he replied. "I just didn't want us to be forgotten." Asha took his hand. "Maybe that's why you were." In the years that followed, the story of the farmers spread beyond the valley, past the borders of Wazit, past the northern quarries and the southern reed marshes. Scrolls turned to carvings. Carvings turned to songs. And songs turned to whispers passed from mother to child, from teacher to student, from one field to the next. Some of those stories were embellished. Heroes conjured from thin air, dramatic rescues, secret codes, but the core never changed. They stood, they remembered, and they taught others to do the same. One particularly dry summer, when the Nile's floods barely reached the edges of the fields, a strange thing happened. A group of travelers arrived, scribes from a distant city, dressed in muted linen, without soldiers. They came not to arrest, not to threaten, but to ask questions. They had heard the songs, and they wanted to know more. Mary, old now, nearly blind in one eye, met them beneath the tamarisk shelter. They brought with them parchment and paints. They asked for names, dates, places. They asked for scrolls, but more than that, they asked for stories. This time, no one hid them. The villagers brought out their jars, their tablets, their linens and etched pots, and clay bricks pressed with names. They showed them how they'd stored them in the walls, buried them beneath trees, woven them into market baskets. And the scribes listened. One of them, the youngest, asked Mary softly, "Do you think your story will be remembered in the capital?" Mary didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Only if someone carries it." The scribe nodded. "I will." And he did. Many decades later, after Mary and Hika and even Asha were gone, that scribe, older now, wiser, stood before a new group of students in a grand hall far from the valley. Behind him, on a stone slab, were the words etched in deep, permanent cuts. History is not only the story of kings. It is the story of those who stood when it sucked to do so. It is the story of farmers. And when the lesson ended, the students filed out one by one. Some laughed, some debated, some simply nodded and took notes. But one girl, quiet and thoughtful, lingered behind. She approached the stone, ran her fingers across the carved words, then pulled a scrap of parchment from her bag and began to write. because she wanted to carry it too. The story continued, not because it was forced, but because it mattered, because it belonged to everyone. And somewhere, in a quiet field beside a forgotten canal, the wind still rustled the leaves of young tamarisk trees. And if you stood still long enough, you might hear it. We are still standing. The scribe's promise was kept. He didn't just carry the story to the capital. He nurtured it like a seed in careful soil. And even though decades passed and the names in the valley faded from everyday talk, their spirit began to echo through unexpected places. The archives that once belonged only to priests now had a new section, the records of the people. Tucked between tales of pharaohs and festivals were small, honest stories, written in simpler hand, on worn parchment, some even copied from the clay and bark scrolls the valley had once hidden. Mary's name was never carved in stone, but the story he lived, that a man who dared to remember when others were told to forget, had woven itself into the soul of the land. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was steady. That was the legacy he left behind. In the valley, things slowly returned to rhythm. The flood still came and left. Crops still rose and fell. Children were still born into hard lives. But something had shifted. The weight of silence had lifted. When the tax collectors returned, they didn't come with threats, but with questions. And when they were answered with truth, not fear, they didn't flinch. Some even stayed, learning how to farm properly instead of just collecting grain. One even asked for a reed pen and started copying names into a ledger, not just for the state but for the people. Asha lived long enough to see this change take hold. She never stopped working. Even in her later years, she helped new mothers with their planting and guided the youngest scribes through their first clumsy lines. Her name, like Mary's, became something spoken with quiet pride. And when she finally passed, the villagers wrapped her in linen embroidered with a single line. She remembered us. Hika's scrolls, copied dozens of times by different hands, found their way into distant towns and tiny market stalls. One fragment turned up in a fisherman's home. Another was buried beneath a stone shrine. But wherever they ended up, they were treated not as sacred relics, but as reminders that real history is made by real people. The tamarisk shelter eventually wore down under time and wind. Its roof collapsed in a spring storm, and for a while, the scrolls beneath were left to the elements. But the villagers gathered again, not in panic, but in purpose. They didn't rebuild the shelter. They built a school, not one made of stone or marble, but of clay and timber. The walls were etched with the same lines they once whispered in fear. Children learned to write their own names, their parents' names, and the names of those who came before. They didn't memorize battles or royal bloodlines. They learned how their ancestors lived when it was hard, how they stood when it was easier to bow, and how they kept the truth alive with ink, not fire. People came from far villages just to sit in the courtyard and listen. Some stayed. Others took the story back with them. All of them left with something more than they brought. Mary's grave, when it finally joined the others beneath the tamarisk trees, had no markings but a small carving of a reed pen and a furrowed field. It was enough. No titles, no statues, just a man who remembered that the past didn't belong to kings. It belonged to the hands that shaped the earth. In time, Egypt changed, as all places do. Cities rose and fell. Rulers came and went. The grand temples aged. But something quiet endured beneath all of it. The idea that even when life is harsh and your name is forgotten, what you do still matters. That stories, once shared, never truly die. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered fragments of the old school near the dry canal bed, they found shards of pottery with children's names etched into them. A few lines of writing, a rough drawing of a farmer, and one phrase carved into a cracked slab of limestone. It sucked being a farmer in ancient Egypt. But we lived, and we remembered. That was the ending the valley chose. Not victory in war, not revenge, not wealth. Just survival, dignity, memory. So as you rest now, listening to the soft hum of the wind in those imagined fields, let that be the final lesson. The people you never read about in golden books, the workers, the mothers, the tired hands that held the soil, they were there, They mattered. And thanks to each voice that refused to be silenced, we still know they were real. And if you're listening now, you're part of their story too.